What's going on, gamers? We got an interesting video here by Digital Foundry that just went live on their website and up on their YouTube page as well, too. Basically showing that they've tested over 20 PSSR2 games. This is going to be an interesting video and how they see that it has obviously huge improvements, as we see right here. It's just as good as they hoped with the PSSR system override toggle. It says right here, over 20 games tested. So we're about to see all the results that they have and what they have to say about it. Oliver and Rich compare notes on the new PSSR in our most expansive test yet. So this is going to be an interesting one. Let's see what they have here. Y'all like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you think. Let's go ahead and put this quality up to 4K so that we can change things on this. Here we go.
Well, hello there, and a warm welcome of sorts back to Digital Foundry. So, over the weeks, we've been looking at the dramatically improved effects of Sony's upgraded form of PSSR based on its Project Amethyst collaboration with AMD. We've seen an actual retail game with native support, Resident Evil Requiem, and we've also examined a total of 5 titles, I think now, whitelisted by Sony that will run with the new PSSR active, overriding the older implementation. But today we're expanding out the coverage. We'll be looking at more of those whitelisted titles, but this video is more of an overview of the impact across all supported games, including those using the enhanced PSSR image quality toggle on the PS5 Pro front end. Where we've had issues with PSSR in the past, before, across the majority of our tested titles, we'll be returning to them and retesting with the quote-unquote PSSR2. Well, I've been talking about we on this, but actually it's Oliver Mackenzie that has done all of the actual work. Hello, Oliver.
Hey, Rich. Yeah, today it's an exciting roundup of some of the most problematic PSSR 1 titles. I think we'll find that most of them are quite heavily improved by PSSR 2.
This video is brought to you by Digital Foundry and the MSI MPG 341 CQR QD OLED X36. This exceptional 34-inch ultrawide is based on the 5th generation QD OLED panel, offering support. So going into this, there's been some confusion about the different implementations of the new PSSR2 on various titles. So I think maybe we begin by hammering this down.
Yeah, so this is a little bit complicated. There are basically 3 ways that the new PSSR can be implemented into a game. The first way, and the most common way, at least by default, is going to be if a game developer has specifically whitelisted their game for the new PSSR. So Sony has listed 11 titles that fall into this category, which I've listed on screen here. Notably, though, no Sony first-party games fall into this category.
Yeah.
So by default, none of these Sony first-party games are getting the new PSSR, apparently, at least according to this list. I've tested some games like Gran Turismo 7, which does revert to the old PSSR if you don't have that toggle enabled. So that's quite notable. The second way is, like I mentioned, if you have a game with the old PSSR and you enable the toggle. So this would be like the vast majority of titles that use the new PSSR or can use the new PSSR, you enable via the toggle basically. And the third way is if a game is specifically patched or released with the new PSSR enabled. So a game like Crimson Desert, for instance.
That's interesting.
Or actually, now that I think of it, Resident Evil Requiem. Those would be the 2 games that I'm aware of that have the new PSSR enabled by default. I mean, I suppose they could also be whitelisted. It's not really clear, but at least based on Sony's description, those games should have the new PSSR natively enabled. In the case of Resident Evil Requiem, it's with the disc copy, like with the day 1 release. With Crimson Desert, it's in a patch. So that's kind of an important distinction because there are like 80-odd PSSR 1 titles that have been listed and described by various outlets out there. And of those, only like, 12 or 13 get the new PSSR by default. So you'll have to enable them manually for the other titles, which I'll talk about in a moment. But basically, in terms of the kinds of changes that we observe with the new PSSR, just in broad strokes, the first major trend is greater stability, especially in motion. So if we look at this tunnel in Gran Turismo 7, all the road paint and the edges of cars are breaking up with the old PSSR. With the new PSSR, it isn't 100% perfect, but it is much cleaner. The second major trend is better clarity. So in Assassin's Creed Shadows, which had very good PSSR already, as I think we documented in earlier coverage, the whole image is sharper. And texture detail is enhanced, especially at a distance. Like those little road textures, wood textures, whatever, they appear with greater clarity with the new PSSR. Yeah. The third thing is that it tends to have minimal noise. Now, we're kind of used to this phenomenon of PSSR noise, sometimes mistaken for film grain, where the first generation PSSR had just a ton of noise throughout the image, did not resolve a very clean and stable image. That is fixed with the new PSSR2, generally speaking. So overall, it's a much better image that holds up to scrutiny across a wide range of games and upscaling scenarios. But Rich, if you'd like, we can touch on some other specific problems that we noted with the old PSSR that were a little bit more impactful, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the document you've supplied here. There's a lot to get through, so let's crack on.
Yeah, so the first major issue I would say is very specific to Unreal Engine 5 and its RTGI noise. So basically, This was a problem with most Unreal Engine 5 games that use PSSR. Basically, PSSR has to interpret detail in its input imagery and determine, is this detail that should be preserved or enhanced, or is it kind of stochastic noise that should be averaged or removed? For some reason, with Unreal Engine 5, PSSR tended to amplify a lot of the RTGI noise, especially with software lumens, that kind of noise from the RTGI.
Definitely was a problem. Noise.
The new PSSR is very good at this, at least about as good as Epic's own TSR in my tests. So in like Silent Hill F, obviously we've documented that. It looks like a completely different game. It's insane the degree to which that's been improved. It's also obvious with Silent Hill 2, at least in its quality mode, which still uses PSSR. Its performance mode uses TSR, but again, much improved there. There's also High on Life 2, recent title, very bad offender with lots of RTGI boil. That's improved. It's important to realize this isn't like ray reconstruction or anything. It's not going to give you a dramatically improved lighting presentation, but it is going to clean up some of those gremlins.
Yeah.
The second major issue I would say is like noisy and soft foliage, because PSSR had an issue with noise in general, but when it applied to foliage, tended to get a lot noisier and failed to resolve stable and clean foliage detail.
100%. We knew
because
this.
I think foliage just poses a lot of problems for upscalers in general. It has lots of sub-pixel details, poor or absent motion vectors, has like lots of, sometimes dithering, sometimes like lots of alpha masking, alpha testing, whatever. Lots of problems with upscalers potentially. But this is a lot better with the new PSSR. So if we look at Avatar, for instance, the foliage is much cleaner. There's less noise. Likewise in Hogwarts Legacy, if you'll note here, the trees in the first generation PSSR have a really odd blurred appearance, and that's no longer the case. So that's a big win for Hogwarts Legacy. Foliage in Star Wars Jedi Survivor is also a lot cleaner, especially in stills. In motion, it still has problems, but it's a definite improvement. Another Star Wars title, Star Wars Outlaws, is also interesting. The grass is no longer blur heavily when the character is moving. I noticed that.
I was playing
but
that
they do
yesterday.
appear a bit flickery and distracting as a result. I think it's still a better image, and obviously it's resolving that detail correctly. So I would count that as a definite win as well. So I think overall it's good at rejecting bad history, preserving good history, and degrading more gracefully here when there are kind of these inclement scenarios for foliage. The third major food group of improvements is particles. So some particles have better handling with the new PSSR. And I thought,
so right off the bat, he's testing all these games, and you guys see that they're all getting improvements here. Definitely when it comes to noising and foliage noising, like the noising over grass and details like that, and not just noising on just objects and stuff, but multiple noising issues. Like we saw that there was a noising issue with ray tracing and Resident Evil on Capcom engine, but that wasn't PSSR. It's something to do with AMD's coding and Capcom's engine, which obviously that can be fixed. But it's interesting seeing these improvements right here, and it's definitely nice. I can't wait to see what else they have to share.
I'd highlight one example from Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. It's just one example here that I think is informative. But the confetti, Alex loves talking about the confetti in Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart.
Yes.
He loves talking about it. So actually, the first generation PSSR did a pretty good job, I thought, especially relative to the old Insomniac solution, the IGTI, Insomniac Games Temporal Injection. I thought it did a good job. But now the confetti is sharper, it doesn't ghost, and it doesn't fade or blend into the background detail as readily, I would say. And PSSR, it doesn't have motion vector to rely on. It might have all kinds of problems here, but it's upscaling it in a way that looks good. It doesn't look like perfectly high resolution necessarily, but you wouldn't expect that from an upscaler, right? Dealing with this kind of information. The best you're going to get is like smooth, reasonably detailed, clean. PSSR 2 does all those things. There are two other improvements that I wanted to touch on a little bit quickly here. In Astrobot and a few other titles, I find that PSSR 2 or new PSSR does a better job with SSR detail. So in the first generation PSSR, Astrobot tended to flicker a lot with its screen space reflections. Yeah. That's been fixed, I would say. There's also less moire artifacts in the images, which are obvious in this opening shot of Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, where that fabric on the rug, on the like red carpet, so to speak, is much cleaner with the new PSSR.
We're seeing it.
So yeah, it does improve a lot of issues across the board in PSSR software. A lot of specific issues Not perfect in all respects, but it's doing quite a good job overall, I would say.
Yeah, it's quite interesting to see that sort of the gotchas, the tests that Alex has kind of accumulated over the years of testing reconstruction-based upscaling. It can kind of like be applied to pretty much all of them, and to the success of them. It's kind of like stress test scenarios to test the, just how good these upscalers are. So to see like positive improvement here, dramatic improvements in some regards, it's pretty good stuff. But again, just looking at your notes here, you're kind of suggesting that there's still some work to be done there. There is still scope for improvement, right?
Yeah, well, it's certainly tough because a lot of these games, it's being implemented without developer oversight or implementation, right? It's just being kind of added as like this crude, like we're swapping out the library option, here be dragons, as I'm sure you would say, right, with a lot of these games. So there are still some issues with some games that perhaps, could be sorted out hopefully in the future with patches or potentially PSSR updates. But there are problems in a few games, like Dragon's Dogma 2, for instance. It still has problems with the kind of holes in the RTGI. So this is a problem I noted actually all the way back at the PS5 Pro preview event back in September 2024. Didn't quite have a language to describe it then, but I did note the issue. Basically, when you move the camera in Dragon's Dogma 2 with some of the higher performance settings, so lower internal resolutions, you get these kinds of holes in the RTGI when you disocclude details, which fill in over time. So, the RTGI is low resolution, the game is low resolution, interacts with PSSR unfavorably, not so good there. With the new PSSR, it's still the same issue, still the same problem, maybe a little bit less impactful, I would say, but still definitely noticeable to the point where it's kind of harder to recommend some of the lower settings, I would say, in this game. Some of the performance mode settings, at least if you are playing with RTGI, which I would argue is a pretty essential part of the game's visual makeup, so I wouldn't recommend stripping it out of the presentation at all. There's also a problem that maybe Tom could speak to a little bit more, because I think he spoke to the game's technical director on this topic, but Black Ops 6 has this problem with shimmering, where PSSR seems to have some bizarre issue with denoising the image, resolves these speckly, sparkly white dots everywhere in the image, or bright dots everywhere in the image. Happens in cutscenes in some cases, happens in darker areas in the image in some cases. This still happens with PSSR 2. Now, the circumstances in which they trigger are a little bit different. Like you have to rotate the camera a little bit differently. You have to get different distances from some objects. But it still shows up, sometimes a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more. Not so ideal there. But yeah, that's kind of, so far it's been mostly positive or at least neutral. But there actually are a couple areas where there are some regressions, unfortunately, which maybe we can touch on.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the game list you've put together here, and it was perhaps inevitable that we've got to talk about Star Wars Jedi Survivor.
This is more of a matter of personal preference, I would say. And I would say overall Star Wars Jedi Survivor looks a lot better with the new PSSR. But the RT reflections can look a bit overly sharp and noisy in motion, like during this Kobo run here of the creek. This is going to be a matter of personal preference, but I kind of like the blurred look of the reflections before, which I think was substantially better. But I would say that overall detail in this scene running forward looks more stable with PSSR 2.
Oh, yeah.
One problem, though, that I did note, maybe not a problem, maybe just a weird characteristic or a quirk, actually, now thinking about it, is there's like that weird dot pattern that Alex noted in some of our earlier coverage that's popping back up here. So it's kind of embedded into textures and into foliage.
Wow, they're professionals.
And it doesn't look bad, and it appears quite stable, but it's weird. So that's a problem that I've noted throughout a couple of games, but it definitely is noticeable here. The second problem I'd note is distant foliage in Dragon's Dogma 2. Now, I'm not too sure what's up with this, but for whatever reason, the dot patterns are back here as well. And distant foliage in Dragon's Dogma 2 is like very blurred, I would say. So overall in Dragon's Dogma 2, I think PSSR 2 is doing a good job. New PSSR is doing a good job. But definitely at a distance, you do notice that blurring of distant foliage, which is just an odd artifact. I'm not quite sure what's causing that. The third problem, the last problem, is that in Assassin's Creed Shadows, the rain can disappear sometimes when it's relieved against certain background elements. So it kind of just disappears in this shot, for instance, where it might be giving maybe too much weight to history when it's against that kind of background or whatever's going on there. It's also kind of it doesn't contrast as heavily against the rain, and the rain almost disappears in that moment. So you can't quite see it anymore. It just kind of fades out. So that's kind of an issue. But again, all these issues are like I'm not necessarily seeing outside of the dot patterns, perhaps I'm not necessarily seeing like a real hard underlying characteristic of the upscaler that couldn't be resolved perhaps in a patch.
Like he said, that's very true, because like these issues that he's finding is just ways to make Sony and AMD aware that you can actually or the developer can come in and patch this in, because you're going to have to, because it's just something that's specifically with your game. But it's these type of issues where it's like you're not going to notice that playing the game. You have to stop and hard stare and zoom in and notice this type of stuff, like the dot stuff. Nobody could ever notice that playing the game regularly. But it's just Digital Foundry giving the most professional analysis that you could have. And that's one thing I like about them, because they help developers clean up all that and optimize as best as they can and get all that going. And that's why people watch them. So these things that he's talking about, though, are like minor issues for developers, but it's not necessarily going to be a problem for a player, because you're not going to notice that type of stuff. The biggest improvements are the stuff that you will notice, and that's the stuff we've been talking about. But it's good to show that, because to perfect the system even more.
To these titles, and
it's
these
a
are
lot of room to
relatively small
improve.
regressions relative to the improvements that we see in other games.
You'd still recommend using the new upscaler as opposed to the old one?
Absolutely. I mean,
Easily.
It's enormously improved, and it does the thing that machine learning upscalers are meant to do, which is that it really handles a really wide range of upscaling scenarios really well. It upscales the image to high resolution with very few faults, and it mostly elegantly handles edge cases quite well, I would say, as well. And it's just nice to look at more than anything else. Like, it has not much aliasing, great texture detail and clarity, good stability in motion, excellent upscaling from low internal resolutions, like we saw with Alan Wake 2, where it's doing like a 2.5x upscale with like, I don't know, 1/6 or 1/7 the internal resolution there. Quite satisfying, at least in terms of pixel count. And it doesn't seem to cause any big issues. It's like a drop-in replacement, like we've noted on PC with upscalers like FSR4. It kind of slots in, does its job, does it well, no major issues.
That's
so
what I was
it's
saying.
really nicely behaved, and it seems to offer PS5 Pro a big image quality enhancement over the other consoles, even when resolutions might not be so different, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wow. I mean, the Disappearing Rain, another classic Battaglia test. It's just fascinating to see how we can replicate these tests across different hardware, different reconstruction techniques. It seems to be sort of like just inherent challenges for these particular machine learning based upscalers. Where do we go next? I guess, we've got Mark Cerny on the record as basically saying that performance is essentially like for like, slightly faster. I think the quoted number was 100 microseconds, which is very, very precise. We've previously looked at performance in terms of, I think we looked at Monster Hunter Wilds, where it was pretty easy to get entirely matched clips there. And it was essentially like for like, right? And that was the basis
FPS
on which the system level
major
toggle was actually implemented, because, Sony realized that, hey, if there's no actual regression in performance here, we can actually slot this in, and there's no or very few regressions. What's your take on performance then?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, we did some performance comparisons earlier and basically found that it was like for like, more or less. But I wanted to do a comparison in one game that hasn't been whitelisted, which is Hogwarts Legacy. And it has an uncapped performance mode that runs either with VRR ideally or without VRR, as we're testing here. And in these two benchmark runs that I ran here, just of a static shot, so it should be identical content, the performance looks nearly identical as I flip back and forth here. Now, technically, the new PSSR runs very, very slightly slower according to our internal tools and our frame rate analysis, because you certainly couldn't see the difference based on the frame rate line, but it runs about half a frame per second slower through the course of this like 40-second benchmark. But I think we're probably well into the territory of perhaps maybe some run-to-run variants, and it's also possible Hogwarts uses DRS in this game. I don't think I've documented that behavior fully, but it could be using DRS in this case. So I think basically performance now equals performance before is a very good heuristic to use. And if anything, like you said, Mark Cerny says that the new PSSR should be 100 microseconds faster to execute, which is 0.1 milliseconds, which if you look at it relative to the old PSSR, that should be about 5% faster, right? So relative to the old PSSR, it should be a little bit faster. In this case, we're not seeing that, but we're also not seeing a dramatic swing in the other direction. It's kind of just like almost exactly like for like. So I'd really say here, new PSSR performance equals old PSSR performance, unless there's some other factors here that are going into it that we can't quite account for, which could be the case across a wide variety of games, right?
Yeah, that's
there
fair.
could be some differences, obviously, but
No
it should
FPS drops.
not
That's the most
differ
impressive thing.
meaningfully in terms of performance.
Right, interesting. I mean, I just think the concept of them being able to match or indeed slightly exceed the performance of the first PSSR is quite remarkable, bearing in mind the sort of across-the-board quality wins that you're getting there. I think that's pretty awesome, especially when you're looking at, additions or changes to like DLSS, which actually result in slight performance drops. The fact that it's kind of like a win across all categories is just absolutely fantastic, which kind of like leads us on to the question of, we've got this system level toggle where you can choose now between what is effectively a less impressive upscaler or a more impressive upscaler. So, I mean, should the toggle be there and should it be enabled by default?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Rich. I think this is a complicated problem because, like you mentioned, it is about the same cost, right? Unlike the new additions to DLSS, which we've seen, like DLSS 4.5, which can have a significant regression in terms of performance. This does not have a significant regression in terms of performance. And it is a competitive upscaler, if not an industry-leading upscaler. When we look at it on PC and its FSR 4.1 guys, it's obviously very competitive and it produces very similar image quality results to the new PSSR. So there's a bit of a question as to whether they should have had the toggle at all or whether they should have enabled it by default. I think it makes sense to enable it by default, but I also see the merits of maybe having a toggle to opt out. I think that makes sense because there are some regressions. It's not always perfect. But there is a weird conservatism to this that makes me think that there's like a political element to this, not to be conspiratorial, or like maybe put more aptly a platform policy element to this as a platform holder. Because we have 80 odd games that are documented to use PSSR. Only like 13 games, as far as I can count, use the new PSSR by default, about 13 games. Sony also hasn't whitelisted any of their own games. So games like Spider-Man, The Last of Us, and Ghost of Yotei, they're on the old PSSR, and I did do some testing in like The Last of Us, those games, for instance. And I found that the new PSSR is definitely an improvement. So it could suggest perhaps a need for a more thorough QA outside of Sony itself, so that the studios and publishers feel confident whitelisting those games. It could also just be an aspect of like, we shipped a version of the game that we know is kind of a known good configuration, and now we don't want to mess that up, right? We want to go through a more thorough QA process, or maybe we don't have the resources to do a thorough QA process, so we're just not going to enable it by default. It also could just suggest, I don't know exactly how much information Sony was providing to developers pre-launch, but the fact there's such limited participation of developers in the whitelisting program so far suggests maybe there was not a ton of information. Again, I don't know, I'm just speculating there. But it feels like there's a weird bit of like platform policy control going on here, especially because, again, we're seeing across Sony's games, they do not seem to be enabling it generally. In Gran Turismo I tested, and there's no enabling of the new PSSR as far as I can see based on the visual results without the toggle turned on. So I don't know what this comes down to. It feels like a weird situation where I would be perfectly fine with enabling it by default. I'd also be perfectly fine with it removing the toggle entirely, just forcing people with the new PSSR, frankly. But there might just be an element of like, hey, we go through a QA process. We have like a technical requirement checklist. We have all these things, and we're not comfortable enabling this feature on the system level by default. It's also a situation almost without precedent, I would say, in console software to have major system level updates, firmware level updates that are massively improving the visual output in games beyond maybe a few points of frame rate here and there, maybe in some titles, or like the removal, maybe the closest thing would be like the removal of the Xbox One's Connect allocation, the 10% of the GPU, the slice that was reserved for Connect.
I remember that.
I'm reaching back there quite a bit, but maybe that's an analogous situation.
The PS4 was so much more powerful in a certain sense.
I'm not sure that actually had an impact on existing titles.
Right.
They would have still used the older allocation, right? They would have still respected that. I think you're quite right. I think it is almost unprecedented. The only other thing I can think of would be backwards compatibility where running old games on new hardware can be quite transformative. And that does just happen out of the box. You can't really opt out of that. So I guess that's the closest parallel. But certainly interesting nonetheless. But I guess it would be a case that officially adopting a new version of PSSR would officially require a new QA pass, which may be quite a lot of work.
Yeah, he's right. So one thing Oliver was saying is that I agree with too. It's like me saying, do I want to toggle for DLSS 4.5 from 4 or from 3 to 4? Like, why would I not go to DLSS 4? It's clearly going to be better than DLSS 3. Like, why would I not go from DLSS 1 to 2 back in the days, or FSR 1 to 2 or 2 to 3? It's like there should be a toggle to where it like just can benefit anything if developers whitelist it. Or just have an option if you want to force it across all games, and if there's a problem, just have a toggle for that to turn off. Maybe there might be more toggle options in the future. I think that's definitely something that matters.
For the developers concerned. I don't know. Maybe we'll find out in due course. But let's sort of just round this off now, because we've looked at a lot of games at this point.
Yeah.
A lot of games. And it's basically just a really good thing that's happened that is quite transformative for the PS5 Pro, because I think the issue before was that, with a Pro machine, you don't actually want to see any kind of regression over the base hardware, and yet we kind of did with certain implementations of PSSR. And you were looking at games like Jedi Survivor and Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora, where PSSR was actually making it look considerably worse than FSR2 actually. So this is just a great thing all around. It's like the promise that the Pro is upon us.
Yeah, I'm definitely feeling that way, especially after the past year and a half of reviewing Pro software. There's always this feeling that the Pro didn't quite measure up to expectations, and a big part of that was PSSR, because we saw a great ray tracing acceleration out of PS5 Pro pretty much from day one with titles like I think F1 24, F1 25, Gran Turismo 7, lots of titles enabling new ray tracing effects on PS5 Pro, but they were always kind of held back by the fact the upscaler was oftentimes not where it needed to be. And yeah, I'm just really happy with this new PSSR in general. Great image quality wins, no performance cost. The only wrinkle now is that you have to be a well-informed user who turns on the toggle to take advantage. Otherwise, you're left with the old experience, at least in games that, extant games that go back however many years in the PS5 Pro's software library. You're not going to get that new experience. At least until more games get patches or get whitelisted. I kind of hope that whitelist improves over time, that it's expanded over time, because based on these results, I would be perfectly comfortable whitelisting every single one of the, I think, 22 or 23 games I tested for this video. And I think it's a no-brainer for the vast majority of titles, at the very least, if not all titles, to get whitelisted, even the ones that did have like a couple regressions here and there.
Yeah, he has a really good point there. And that pretty much sums up this video. I want you guys to let me know what you think about this. All the improvements are there. We see it. They're very happy with the results. And if there's any little bugs, Digital Foundry, they'll hard stare and find it. But it's stuff that's not really going to affect us, but something that can just be cleaned up to give you a much better image quality. So I want you guys to let me know, once again, what you think. Leave a comment down below. Are you happy with the games that you've tested? And are you looking forward to future games? Definitely stuff like GTA, Sorrows, Wolverine, and stuff like that. And other games, third-party games, are going to be getting improvements as well. So yeah, I definitely like this video and let us know a lot of things. Definitely about the whitelist stuff. So I was like, okay, so there's 3 aspects to PSSR2. There's the custom patch, like with Resident Evil and Crimson Desert. There's the toggle, and then there's developers whitelisting games. And then we were hoping there was an option where you would just be able to have a backwards compatibility support to see if you could toggle it on for any PlayStation 5 game and have that for PS6 as well. That would be nice. So yeah, guys, keep on gaming no matter what platform you're on. Peace out. Thank you for all the support. Later.